Bom dia, pessoal. Muito obrigada por prestigiar as nossas conferências da Escola de Educação Física e Esporte, agora no segundo semestre. Tá? Eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Michele apresentar adequadamente o UDO, né? Mas é uma grande oportunidade tê-lo aqui e eu agradeço, via Michele, a oportunidade de tê-lo aqui, de conversar conosco, de falar da área de atuação de vocês. Isso é muito rico, essa diversidade dentro das nossas conferências. Então, agradeço a Michele pela iniciativa e a gente dá todo o suporte para vocês. Eu gostaria que vocês assinassem aqui a lista de presença, que a gente sempre faz um levantamento numérico de quanto a gente tem de acessos pelo YouTube, nosso canal de YouTube, quantas pessoas vêm aqui nas nossas conferências. A gente tem todo um levantamento e também, se vocês assinarem aqui, vocês vão ter acesso, né, ao certificado de vocês da palestra, tá ok? Muito obrigada, viu? Eu passo então a palavra a Michele. Obrigada. Thank you, Udo, for coming. And I will ask now Michele to introduce you.
Bom, eu gostaria de agradecer a parceria entre a Comissão de Pós-Graduação e a Comissão de Pesquisa. Então, a gente trouxe o professor Udo Merkel por um apoio financeiro da pós-graduação. E aí nós atuamos em parceria com a Comissão de Pesquisa para que ele se envolvesse também com o Seminário de Educação Física e Esporte, que a Comissão de Pesquisa já tem consolidada todas as terças-feiras, das 11h30 à 1h. Então, para quem está aqui a primeira vez, fiquem atentos, porque é muito comum a gente ter essas palestras todas as terças-feiras. E o professor Udo, ele foi contactado por interesse do nosso grupo de estudos e pesquisa em ginástica, porque nós estudamos muitos eventos de ginástica, sobretudo os grandes festivais. E um desses festivais é o Festival Arirang, que por acaso o professor Udo esteve e atualmente, inclusive, trabalha com o governo da Coreia do Sul, por isso que ele esteve na Coreia do Norte, para estudar um pouquinho esse evento. Enfim, ele tem tramitado nesses bastidores entre as duas Coreias e essa relação dos eventos esportivos e o poder e a política e tudo mais. Então, nós trouxemos, né, por esse viés, no entanto, estamos nos surpreendendo o quanto nós estamos abrindo nossos olhares para os eventos esportivos sobre o viés sociológico, político e também de criação aí de identidade e comunidade. Então, o professor Udo, ele tem a formação em Ciências do Esporte, Ciências Sociais e Educação. Atualmente, ele trabalha na Universidade de Brighton. Ele morou 3 meses em Florianópolis, então, quando ele teve um momento sabático aí, que a gente chama, então ele escolheu o nosso país para morar e eu acho que isso já demonstra essa nossa facilidade até em lidar com ele, como ele tem se encontrado bem com a gente, com o nosso jeitinho brasileiro. Bom, então eu agradeço a vinda do professor Udo e a disponibilidade e aproveito para convidá-los para o seminário que nós faremos quarta e quinta, amanhã e quinta, sobre eventos esportivos. Aí amanhã de manhã ele vai falar sobre o Festival Arirang, que é atualmente o maior festival de ginástica oficialmente do mundo. Tá? Ele tem um viés político muito forte, então ele vai contar um pouquinho sobre isso. À tarde ele vai contar sobre essa relação dos fãs e o desenvolvimento dos clubes da Alemanha, porque ele nasceu na Alemanha, né, depois que ele fixou residência na Inglaterra. E na quinta-feira de manhã ele vai contar como que ele pesquisa nesses grandes eventos, porque a gente sabe que é sempre um desafio. Então eu quero pesquisar sobre algo, quem eu procuro, né? Então, e especialmente esses grandes eventos, né? Um professor que pesquisou na Coreia do Norte, que a gente já sabe de todo o viés de fechamento de barreiras, de fronteiras e tudo mais. Então, como que ele foi adentrando e como que ele adquire todas as informações para escrever cientificamente e analisar cientificamente isso. E quinta à tarde, a gente tem convidado um grupo de pesquisa da Unicamp para conversar com a gente sobre os eventos. Então, a gente tem, na verdade, a Tamires, do Giminusp, que vai falar sobre o evento nacional do México, e eles vão apresentar os eventos da República Tcheca, da Dinamarca, da Alemanha. Então, o Deutsche Turnfest, por exemplo, que tem 100 mil pessoas participando. Então, para quem não conhece esses grandes eventos ginásticos, é uma oportunidade, vocês estão convidados. Tá bom? Então, agora deixo a palavra para o professor Hugo.
Obrigada.
Good morning, everybody. I have no idea what Michelle just said about me. Was it good news or bad news? Oh, good. Okay, I'm very pleased about this. Which leads me to my first apology for today. I'm really sorry I cannot do this presentation in Portuguese, because this is not a language I speak. I operate in 3 other languages, German, English, and Castellano, and if it helps and you have questions, because there is an issue of understanding, please do interrupt the lecture. Do not wait until the end. Just interrupt it. Maybe I can help with Castellano, because I know a lot of people speak that language here. Otherwise, I will try and rephrase certain things. Okay? So, thank you very much for coming. My voice is usually strong enough, but I have to use the microphone for the recording. And once I drop it down and down and down, you have to tell me. Okay, I want to talk to you about sports mega events. And I know that you have just experienced 2 mega events in this country. There were obviously the Olympic Games and there was the Football World Cup. And there is a bigger story about these events to tell in the meantime, because we actually do quite a lot of research. And I want to summarize some of the research my team and I have done in the past, which is very much about the fundamental question: what do these mega events leave behind? What do they cause? And that is linked with a bigger kind of academic as well as very, very important question about our lives on this planet here, which is with the question of sustainability. Can we sustain, can we maintain the lifestyle we actually currently live? So that is the wider academic background. Structure of my lecture, and I will try to keep it to about 1 hour, so there is time for questions, but again, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. I don't have any problems with that. It's very much quick definition of socioeconomic sustainability, because most people quite often think about sustainability only in environmental terms. But that term is actually covering a much broader field of concerns. Secondly, a little bit of history, just a few slides. Third, and that's quite important in order to understand what's happening with mega events these days, it's what lots of people refer to, the modernization. Modernization is a wonderful word, has been abused in lots of different contexts, sounds fantastic, but the reality is quite often problematic, which is covered up through this word modernization. And then the key issues here really, what has gone wrong with these mega events? Because they are not as great in terms of delivering consequences, delivering outcomes, and so on. And the second big issue, what is happening right now, because their existence is, I would argue, at least threatened, because there are more and more people raising concerns, and there is the future of mega events has to be rethought, which is very much about the kind of conclusion. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm a social scientist, and social scientists have the bad habit and must always declare where they actually come from. So my background is very much in sociology, economics, and political sciences, and I have specialized in the world of sport events, but I'm also dealing with other kinds of events here. So I'm a critical sociologist. I'm not just a sociologist. Traditionally, sociologists tend to describe, tend to analyze, and then tend to theorize. But there is a fourth level, which is quite important and also a little bit contested. Contested because it is about critical evaluation, critiquing the existence of certain things in society and culture. I'm one of those sociologists who dare to do something which sociologists are not supposed to do, to also raise or express critical opinions. And that goes very much back to something which is quite interesting, because one of the first books I had to read when I was studying pedagogy back in Germany was actually Paulo Freire, who comes from this country, and I've taken a few things on board here, which is, I think, a nice quote. The educator has the duty of not being neutral, because we do not live in neutral, objective societies. There is a lot of ideology around us, which we have to take on board here. In addition to spending half a year at the University of Brighton in the south of England, if you know where London is, then Brighton is just down on the coast. I only worked there for 6 months. I worked with the South Korean government, and I worked with the European Union, the Council of Europe, as a kind of policy advisor on the use of sport events as a political tool. So that's a little bit about my background here. Sustainability, usually focuses, and this is where the critical element comes in already, on 3 different things, all starting with a P. There are the people, of course, there is our planet, of course, and then, and there is no of course here for me, there is the notion of profits. Profit, people and planet. Sounds good because of the alliteration, the 3 Ps, but I'm not quite sure whether it makes sense to assume that all economic systems must be organized along the principle of making profit. There are still a few exceptions, like North Korea, Laos. They have centrally regulated economies. So, to put that in there, I would argue is already ideologically loaded, and we have to keep that in mind. I certainly agree with the kind of picture on the right, that at the heart of our lives there is obviously economic arrangements, that there are societies that are governed by economic arrangements, and that there is our physical environment. But I'm not quite sure about the notion of profit. So, and yet there is no other kind of widely accepted definition of sustainability than this one, which is the most popular one. And that clearly says we, as human beings, have to make sure that we live our lives in a way that the next generation can live their lives in a satisfactory, in a content way, so that we, the current generation, do not destroy, do not damage, do not cause any negative impact, which will then mean the next generation of people will actually struggle, will suffer, or will have serious problems. That's the kind of working definition of sustainability which I would like to use here. To set the scene in terms of mega events, because I assume not a lot of people will have a kind of detailed understanding of this, there are kind of 2 phases. Maybe we're entering a 3rd one right now. But the first phase was really from the end of the 19th century. Does anybody know first Olympic Games? First kind of mega event, 1996 in Athens. Then the first World Cup, just down the road from here, in Uruguay, 1930. That was the kind of start of mega events. At the same time, there were others like the World Fair, expos, and so on. So, for about over 100 years now, we have mega events happening and growing, dramatically growing. But this history of mega events from the beginning to 1984 is also a history of events causing lots of problems. And before 1984, hosting one of these events was really not something popular, quite the opposite. When they had meeting at the IOC and then there was an agenda and the agenda said who is hosting the next Olympics, everybody in the room reacted like students who hadn't done their homework. Looked up. Nobody wanted to be seen, nobody wanted to raise their hands, nobody wanted to do this because up to 1984 it was really spending a lot of money for an international event which became bigger and bigger, but nobody got anything out of it. So, and if we go into more detail and look at the 1930 Soccer World Cup, the national rivalries between Uruguay and Argentina, that became a football war during that kind of context. You may be aware of the infamous Nazi Olympics, Hitler, fascism, Germany, 1930s, the Nazi Olympics where the fascist regime really politicized the Olympic Games. Mexico, 1968, hundreds of students got killed because they were protesting against the redirection of funds from education, from welfare to the Olympic Games here. We have Montreal in 1976, and the impact of this event lasted until about 4 years ago, because only 4 years ago the people of Montreal continued to pay off the event that took place in 1976. They paid over 30 years money back here. Moscow Olympics, big boycott, part of the Cold War, where the US president, a farmer producing peanuts, a man called Jimmy Carter, suggested that the West shouldn't go because the North, because Russia had just invaded Afghanistan. Nowadays in Afghanistan, everybody does it. The Americans try to do it first, get everybody else on board. But in 1980, that was a big issue and caused a big boycott. So, just a quick kind of overview here of some of the key events leading up to 1984. 1984 is the kind of watershed here, because these were the first Olympics ever that produced a profit. And that was very much down, does this work? To this gentleman, Peter Uberroth. He was the organizer of the 1984 Olympics, and he had some fundamental principles that worked very, very well. Number one, keep it simple and keep it cheap. So, some of the facilities, that was just a couple of holes, plus some concrete seats and nothing else. There was no concern about aesthetic architecture impressing the rest of the world. As little investment as possible to have minimum and bare facilities. Principle number one. Principle number two, get as many sponsors on board to pay for things so that the American state didn't have to pay for it. Because in North America, the state does not necessarily provide funds for these kind of events. It's a fundamental policy that this is a private sector affair. It's got nothing to do with the state. So, and Uberroth managed to really attract a lot of companies who became sponsors and really paid for events. And he was absolutely ruthless and even managed to generate hundreds and thousands of dollars by selling miles of the torch relay. Do you remember before the Olympics, the torch was carried through the whole of Brazil and other parts of Latin America and so on. And usually this is a kind of reward or appreciation for athletes who have done very well, for citizens who have done very well, to be part of something bigger here. And Peter Uberroth really said, well, actually, there are so many people in North America, in the US, would like to do it, we just sell it. And they sold every mile for $1,500. That's how you can make money. And in this kind of context, obviously North America is relatively big. The torch relay became bigger and bigger and bigger because every mile was another $1,500, $1,500. So, and the outcome of this was fairly straightforward. They made huge profits. And that changed the kind of events landscape. Because from that point onwards, everybody was thinking, actually, if it is possible to make money out of them, we want them. That's really why 1984 is the kind of big watershed. And that means since then, hosting events, mega events, has become extremely popular and has had lots of consequences here. Number one is, nowadays, well, not nowadays, up until recently, there were always dozens of countries who said, yes, we want them, which meant those organizations who own the brand FIFA Soccer World Cup or International Olympic Games, these are brands, these are names and brands at the same time, countries had to bid. And even the bidding itself became very lengthy, very, very expensive. Minimum a country has to invest to bid for an event is in the region of $35 to $40 million. That's the minimum you have to have just to bid. And it might just be thrown out because there's only one winner. There is no silver medal. There's only a gold medal. It led to, which obviously I've just read some news about some Brazilian officials involved, and there's corruption at every level, which I don't think we have to talk about because that's something quite big here. It led to the modernization of events, and I come back to this term here. And it led to overspending, and ultimately, and that's what I want to focus on in a few minutes, on more and more resistance to hosting these kind of events. But we have to go back to the term modernization, which has been broadly used and involves a large number of much smaller processes. From an economic perspective, there are the kind of 4 key terms which are used in the context of almost all developments in the world of sport. There is the commodification. Something becomes a commodity. Something becomes a product with a price. This microphone is worthless right now because it's in use. We need it here. But if I add a price label and offer it to the market, that's the commercialization, then it is a commodity which becomes available. Professionalization, meaning 2 things: higher levels of performance of the athletes in the world of sport, of the musicians, if we talk about big music events here, as well as the performers being paid for their performances here. And ultimately, the process of bourgeoisification, and I'm drawing on a French word. Bourgeoisie in French means middle class. Changing these events to meet the needs and expectations of middle-class people rather than everybody. The simple reason, the middle class simply has more disposable income than, for example, working class or underclass people in modern societies. Number 1. Second element of the modernization process, very much linked to the growing interest of commercial and political forces. Sponsors had noticed that these events would be good for advertising, for marketing purposes. And politicians also recognized that these events could be used to pursue a large number of political objectives. And I come back to this because this politicization and the increasing, I call it appropriation. If we want to be critical, we could call it hijacking, taking over, slowly taking over by commercial and political forces. They are largely responsible for some of the contemporary developments here. Modifications of events to put in, for example, sports with a high media appeal. For example, having soccer in the Olympic Games, funny one, but obviously increases the amount of people who wish to watch Olympics, get involved in Olympics, although otherwise they don't really have an interest in these. And also other events that attract other consumer groups here. Time and space, important. For example, a few years ago, Beijing, all these swimming competitions happened at lunchtime in Beijing. Simple reason, that was even in the United States, where ABC wanted the cover of the swimming events because they attract large audiences. Impact of this is not a lot of world records were broken in Beijing because swimmers are not at their best at lunchtime. They need a little bit longer to really produce top-level performances and break world records. There are clear statistics when the best time of the day is for them. Lunchtime isn't, okay? So, and space, of course, in order to make everything accessible for TV cameras and have the best shots on television. Globalization, particularly important here in terms of attracting global audiences. Spectacularization, make it really memorable. Yeah, memorable is something which is quite important for the definitions of spectacles here. And turning some of these kind of events into political projects. It led the outcome, and that's what we have seen over the last kind of 20 years now, to the emergence of mega sport events with truly global appeal. Opening ceremonies quite often are the most attractive elements of Olympic Games, watched on average between 3.5 and 4 billion people across this planet. There is hardly anything else which unites the world in that way, that 3.5 to 4 billion people sit in front of the telly at the same time. Again, an increase in the competition to get the right to host these events, and the use of socio-economic, or the use of events as socio-economic and political tools. Media and sponsors became key stakeholders during this phase, and that's quite important. So, politicization, we need to go into this because that is something big which people have become to resist here. Fundamental question is, and maybe somebody has any thoughts on this, why is it that politicians nowadays, why governments nowadays have such a keen interest not only in sending teams to these international events, but also hosting them? Any idea what motivates politicians to really, and I think we have seen Lula here together with Pelé. This was 7 years before the Olympic Games actually took place in this country, going to, I think, Oslo, where the decision was made. How your president, why does he go and really promote this? What is it? Any thoughts from you?
Make their names in history.
Absolutely. Politicians are a vain, and they're thinking about the next elections, so they get media coverage. What else? Why is it that politicians really love to support and have these events in their countries? Sorry? To save money?
To save money.
To take some money, yes. Let's be, let's say, to make some money.
Yeah, better.
For themselves, maybe for companies that are related to them. Most of the building contracts in the context of building Olympic Games all over the world, there has been corruption involved. There has been corruption in the marketing contracts and so on. But officially they say, we as a country, yeah, politicians as well as people, will have economic benefits. We will make money out of this. So, 2 reasons. Give me a third and then I'll show you the list, which is really long. Why is it that politicians love to host international events, mega events, particularly in their host countries? No? Okay. Here's the answer. There is a domestic agenda, which we'll focus on, and there is an international or global agenda here. Global agenda, very quickly, and I hope that makes sense, it's about international recognition, it's about prestige. If you can organize something like this, you must be good. It's about public relations and foreign policy and using sport as a soft power tool. Soft power as a means of attracting other countries because they have a sense that you are an attractive partner to deal with culturally, economically, socially.
When you say about soft power, you're talking about the soft power of Joseph Nye, the one he explained.
Yes, it is.
How to position yourself as a central leader in your environment or political environment.
Absolutely.
Did you see that has... I really don't see how this is really getting effect in politics. It's opening the lines of credits.
Absolutely.
And money is changing places all the time.
Yes.
And you're building huge facilities for most of the time a month of use. But again, I don't see as China has become more likable.
Yes, but that's what
but actually it became stronger. So it's really soft power, or is hard power? It's hard power covered by a mask.
It's a combination of both, because obviously China also has economic leverage and the money to invest in these kind of games. But what China wanted to get out of them is a legacy, that it hosted the biggest event in the world, that it did well, and so on. Yeah? In the case of China, there was also a little bit of disempowerment, losing soft power, because in the run-up to these big events, journalists obviously cover every aspect of the country. And they were dealing with issues, problems in China, whether it was freedom of speech, whether it was Tibet, whether it was minorities, and so on. Yeah? But you're absolutely right. China, combination of soft power and hard power. Yeah? But the legacy of the Olympics for ordinary citizens all over the world was, wow, they put a big party on. That's the global agenda. Domestic agenda here, yeah, nation building, national unity, brings people together, particularly when you think about emotional involvement in the world of soccer. It's about national pride, patriotism. It integrates even minorities for a short period of time. Events have educational benefits. They quite often provide the reason, sometimes the pretext. Pretext means it's an artificially created reason. It's a good opportunity to do something which otherwise you wouldn't do here. For certain social policies here, it's about income generation, making money, and it's also about the use of facilities afterwards. These are the kind of ideas politicians have. These are the kind of hopes they have when they support, not just morally, the bidding for the right to host an event, but also providing huge funds, money for events. We can summarize this quite quickly and say, well, politicians hope, expect, and definitely promise, as politicians do, a number of impacts. Impacts are short-term consequences. Legacies are long-term consequences. They definitely offer impacts which could be described as social, which is about the local as well as the national community. They promise economic impacts, income generation, more tourism, improved infrastructure, increased employment opportunities, and so on. And maybe this rings a bell, because Rio and the World Cup is not that long ago, and maybe you remember some of these things here. Cultural opportunities, politically, we've touched on this one, and also environmental, because hosting these events quite often requires the building of new venues, the trying out of new, more sustainable policies, and so on. That's what they hope for, expect, and definitely promise. The trouble is, events management degree programs and people like myself who have been researching these kind of things, there is a very clear response to this. This is very much hopeful thinking, but the reality is that mega events do hardly or do not deliver these promises. Quite the opposite. They create what you can see here, Olympic facilities, only 10 years old, from a little bit more than 10 years from Athens, that cost the Greek state millions per year for security purposes. But they're not in use any longer. This is 20 years ago now. This is Atlanta, where you have big fences around all the facilities. I do not remember the locations of these photos, but if you just look at Google post-Olympic venues, there are thousands of images that tell exactly the same kind of story here. That, I think, was a velodrome at one point, so for cycle races here. That was for canoeing, and I think it was actually in Beijing. Can't remember these ones, but I think the pictures are very clear. These venues are not used afterwards, and quite frankly, it was a waste of money if you only use them for 2 weeks for a mega event and then nothing happens with them afterwards. The hosting of these mega events has caused a large number of problems and not met the expectations, not met the promises here. One of the biggest issues, and the degree varies from country to country, is about getting rid of undesirable people, homeless people, poor people. And the worst example here is China, and I will come back to this in a minute. It means that areas of big cities are used to build Olympic venues, for example, which leads to the breaking up of established communities. Quite a normal thing these days here. And of course, the big issue, it leads to a redistribution. Yeah? Money goes from some areas that are quite essential, which could be social welfare, could be education, could be health, into this kind of big prestige object, yeah? Hosting a mega event here. Afterwards, we have seen, and this is a tendency since 1992, that when venues for mega events are built in poorer area of towns, afterwards they become desirable and the middle class moves in. Yeah? Because there are more parks, more facilities, if they use this. And we call this gentrification. Yeah? It's an old-fashioned word for the middle class that moves into kind of redeveloped urban areas where traditionally poor people had their home. And for them, housing becomes unaffordable. And the worst cases here, 2 of them, I've mentioned Montreal right at the beginning, that the citizens of the city of Montreal continued to pay for the 1976 Olympics for about 30 years. And I'm not sure whether you are aware of this, but quite a few years the state of Greece was close to bankruptcy and had to be bailed out by the European Union. And one of the reasons is they totally overspent on the hosting of the 2000 Olympic Games. Replacement, dislocation of people, we can find this in the context of all mega events. It's only the scale, the size, or the numbers of people who are affected. So London 2012, we are talking about a few thousand people here, 1,000 or 2,000. Beijing, you've mentioned Beijing, we're talking about 1.2 million people whose traditional living arrangements, it's the principle of hutongs, which means very small communities with communal facilities, for example, toilets, showering, around a little square. It was just the bulldozers going in order to make that rather poor part of Beijing the center of the Olympic Games. So 1.2 million people were actually dislocated, removed from their homes that you can see at the bottom of the slide here. The same happened a few years later in South Africa. We're talking about tens of thousands of poor black communities that were forced, literally forced, out of their homes and relocated quite nicely 30 kilometers away in tin towns. And that's a documentary one of my students did at one point. You may find it on YouTube, it's very short, 15 minutes. But literally living in containers, kind of 2 meters wide, 4 meters long. These big transport containers that are used on ships going across the Atlantic and other places. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people being moved, not to be seen by the tourists and football fans coming to South Africa for that kind of event. Redistribution of public funds, I understand, was a big issue here in this country over the last few years in the context of both the Soccer World Cup as well as the Olympics. So I don't think I need to say a lot about that kind of issue. We also know from research that mega events do deliver benefits. However, not necessarily for those groups they were promised to. But the clear winners here are media corporations in conjunction with the sponsors and the two big organizations, the International Football Association, FIFA, and the International Olympic Committee, who have contracts with each country who hosts one of their big events. And sometimes these countries are very naive and sign contracts which makes them send most of the profits to Switzerland, which is where both organizations actually hosted. They do not even negotiate hard enough to keep profits. Contracts with FIFA and IOC also mean that during the period of time of the mega event, several weeks before and several weeks afterwards, all the sponsors do not have to pay any taxes in the countries where the events are actually hosted. So, FIFA, IOC, big winners, tourism industry also makes quite a lot of money, but the local communities, the national or nation states that host these mega events, they do not really get or only get delivered a very, very small amount of the promises that have been made before. These mega events also reveal a number of social inequalities. They make class societies, systems, very visible. I don't know whether you are aware of this, but whenever there is a mega event like the Olympics, and I wonder whether Sao Paulo could do this or would totally collapse here, you have one lane dedicated to the Olympic family to travel from hotels or other places where the Olympic family, in inverted commas, stays. So, which meant, I think in London it was about 60 kilometers of roads had an Olympic lane which nobody else could use. You may think that makes sense because you want athletes, you want teams, you want referees to arrive on time. That makes sense, doesn't it? Well, the problem here is that what is the Olympic family? 89% of the Olympic family are sponsors and the media. It's only 11% the athletes, the teams, the sponsors. So almost 90% of the people who are stakeholders of events are obviously media people, journalists, sponsors, and so on. They have a quick ride through the city of London, or in this case, maybe at one point. I know it's impossible in Sao Paulo, but just imagine this. That suddenly you have one lane less and there's occasionally a car from a media company or a sponsor. Usually, 20 people wish to buy one ticket. So there's competition for tickets in the Soccer World Cup as well as the Olympic Games. And there's obviously kind of computer programs and you have to bid for them and you only get one out of the 10 you wanted and all these kind of things. And yet, that's typical. Do you know why? Because a large percentage of all tickets have gone to the media and the sponsors who give the tickets to business partners who like to be treated well on their trip to Rio, to London, to other places, but going and watching some Olympic competitions, nah, they really don't want to do this. So and that causes sometimes a public outcry because there are millions of people who wanted to take some of these seats and the tickets have gone to sponsors whose business partners don't use them. So one strategy nowadays is, this was quite blunt, you just put a few soldiers in there. But you can obviously see these are soldiers. A day later, this is a picture from London, the soldiers were asked not to wear uniform, but civilian clothes, and come and fill the empty seats. So it didn't look bad on television that there were empty seats, and that people were not moaning, why didn't I get the ticket for this event? So, hosting these mega events also reveals hypocrisies. You know what hypocrisies are? When you say one thing and you do another. Yeah? When I tell you live a healthy lifestyle and eat a McDonald's burger at the same time, that's a hypocrisy. And if I go back to the London Olympics, look at the main sponsors, they're down here. Number one, a company I really hate, McDonald's, because they're so unhealthy. Number two, a company which sells you sugar, yeah, which is very much chocolate. And number three, brown water with a bit of sugar in there, Coca-Cola. And one of the key issues politicians promised the people in Britain, saying, the Olympics will really help changing people's attitude towards healthy lifestyles. Well, how can you promote a healthy lifestyle and at the same time have the most unhealthy sponsors on board? These are the hypocrisies, because these sponsors paid most money. We know that big multinational corporations, quite often ones that have a doubtful reputation, like to use these mega events to kind of greenwash or whitewash their reputation, because they are associated with something which is enjoyable, which is popular, which is exciting, which is the Olympics, which is the World Cup. And we have here the case of, does anybody remember this image? 8 years ago, Gulf of Mexico, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, largely responsible for negligent maintenance, was a company called British Petroleum, BP, big company, who then quickly became one of the sponsors of the British team at the Olympics to really do something about their reputation. Mega events also show us that in the world of sport there is a process happening which we call deterritorialization. Deterritorialization quite simply means you take a cultural practice, a sport, out of one space and move it to a different space in which it has no roots, no home, nothing. And as you can see, the picture on the left, does anybody recognize the city in which a very popular American game, American football, regularly takes place? Can you recognize the city here in the background?
London.
That is London. Yeah, the NFL regularly plays matches in London. Or maybe you are still surprised, like I am, that a country like Qatar, with a lot of history and success in the world of football, is hosting the Soccer World Cup. That's what we call deterritorialization of sport. Okay, if we want to organize this mess, this is just lots of examples. I've suggested to think about three kind of concentric layers here, really right in the middle, and I'm taking a slightly broader view now. I'm going beyond just hosting mega events. I'm talking about events as a whole, because I'm interested as a conflict theorist in the nature of different conflicts here. If we go right from the middle, which is the core or the essence, to the conditions of the event and then the general environment. The last one is the most important one because that is the most contested one right now. So right at the center of these concentric circles is sometimes the essence of an event. There are events that are nowadays contested because of the nature of the essence of the event. Do we still find Miss World competitions that promote a sense of femininity that focuses on body aesthetics and totally ignores the mind, the brain, intelligence of women appropriate in the 21st century? There are quite a few things, and I'm one of them who find that a little bit difficult to accept that this is still an ideal representation of women. There are lots of people who struggle with the essence of a number of events that involves animal cruelty, whether this is cockfighting, whether this is bullfighting, and lots of other things. Okay? There is some contestation here. That's right at the center. In terms of conditions of the actual event, that's sometimes questions of logistics, whether certain facilities haven't been finished, it can't be used, whether the kind of physical environment really in terms of pollution in this kind of context is ideal for physical contests in the world of sport here, or whether this is simply the facilities of athletes that are not appropriate for international standards and preparation for events and so on. Most important one here, and that's the one which has become increasingly contested, is very much the layer which is about socio-economic background, political, cultural, and so on. And that raises from issues such as the politicization. Here we have two unpopular British politicians who use the Olympics. We have BP, British Petroleum, as an example already. Or even the fundamental question, does it make sense to host mega events in societies that treat women as second-class citizens? Yeah? Or in societies where the workforce is largely coming from other countries, whose passports are taken away, who are paid slave wages and are treated as slaves. These are the kind of layers of contestation. So, contestation is a theoretical concept, leads in the real world, in practice, to resistance and rebellion here. And I guess you will have seen this because that was something which I took from here. Causes, and that almost summarizes some of the things I have said before, the unjustified spending of public funds. It would certainly be justified if they delivered afterwards, would be fair enough to say, yep, we have to invest that amount of money in order to get these things out of it. Fine. But here the issue is unjustified spending of public funds, which is related to the second biggest concern. There is plenty of empirical evidence and personal evidence of the people who are affected by the hosting of events that the promised impacts, short-term consequences, legacies, long-term consequences are not happening here. The displacement and enforced relocation of people has become a big issue. There is a kind of global movement that helps people who are threatened with this issue. Environmental concerns, because everybody promises to be environmentally friendly, but then due to the overspending, cuts usually have to be made when it affects environmentally friendly technology here. Choice of sponsors has become contested. There are concerns. The public is growing more, is becoming more critical and really challenging sponsors such as BP here. There is a general distrust these days that anything which has to do with FIFA and the IOC, one has to be very careful, A, because of the issue of corruption, and B, because they like to rip off host countries. There's no doubt about this one, because they really live on these kind of funds, and both organizations are extremely rich. And the issue of corruptions. Other concerns, communities are alienated, they're not engaged in the process here. Community image can be negative afterwards. Sometimes it's simple inconveniences like overcrowding, pollution, and so on. Traffic congestion, okay, I'm talking to people who live in Sao Paulo, maybe I shouldn't mention that one here. But increase of crime, property damage here, disturbances through noise and visual things, and tourist avoidance, and lots of people leave cities, and I'm one of these who do this because when it gets too overcrowded, I rather disappear. So, outcome of these developments, generally growing skepticism about the benefits of hosting mega events here. The lack of initially public support, more recently also political support, the absence of that kind of support. Referendums, come back to this here. And, that's the interesting one. Nowadays, the number of countries who wish to host events has considerably declined. So far, for the Soccer World Cup in 2030, there's only 3 applications. One is Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. One is Morocco and other North African countries. And the third one is Britain, not England, Britain. Britain meaning England together with Wales and Scotland, definitely Northern Ireland is not yet clear. That's unusual, because at this stage usually we're about 10, 12 who were expressing an interest. Right now it's 3. Britain is firm as a bidder. Mauricio Macri is mad if he does it, but I think he thinks he can win the next general elections next year if he promises to deliver that. Although Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay do not have any infrastructure and would have to invest billions of dollars here. And Morocco has some experience and would do it in combination with other North African countries. There is a little bit of infrastructure already. So, more and more citizens in particularly European countries have said, actually we have fairly democratic systems. These are issues that are of general and public interest, and we would quite like to have a vote on this. And if you collect a certain amount of signatures, I do not remember how many you need, you can have a referendum. Interesting thing here is that all referendums so far held in mainland Europe over the last 5 years, Munich, Oslo, Stockholm and Hamburg, the outcome was always almost 2/3, sometimes 55%, sometimes 62% against. All of them. There's not a single referendum yet where the people were convinced that these events would deliver what politicians would promise before. In the context of Boston and Toronto, there were initiatives to submit a bid, and it was actually the the city authorities, the local councils, the Lord Mayor and the groups around them, who make quite a clear point and say, well, we do not believe and we know that these events deliver what they're promised, and we do not actually wish to engage in that kind of bidding process. So that's what I mean with kind of decline in public and political support. So, my last point, time is failure, right? What can be done? Okay, there's two ways about this. We can, what the British call, we can tinker at the edges. To tinker at the edges means we can change lots of little things, but leave everything in place. Okay, so we can modify a few things, but don't have a radical solution. I'll come up with a radical solution in a second. And that means that when you plan it, all groups who have an interest in the event, they're called stakeholders. All stakeholders need to be part of that kind of process here. Local communities need to get involved, because local communities nowadays are totally ignored in the planning process. This is done almost by central government these days. Maybe somebody should go to FIFA and IOC and some of these host countries and explain the important concept of modesty. To be modest, not going for gigantic stadiums, gigantic spending of money, because they live in a different world than ordinary people here. There's absolutely no transparency so far about accounts, what is spent on what, because FIFA and the IOC sit in a exist and have their headquarters in a European country that is very proud of its bank secrecy. That country is called Switzerland. Switzerland is very different from the European Union in terms of laws affecting transparency, accountability. That's obviously why they have chosen to have their headquarters here. Organizers should be more aware of the background of the sponsors and choose sponsors accordingly. People and organizers need to be standing up more against the ruthlessness of commercial forces, because they really dictate contents of the event, timing of stuff, spaces, and so on, because they are obviously important for the sponsors. With the sponsors, the money is coming in, and so on. There needs to be much more planning for impacts as well as legacies here, and most events management groups who deal with mega events stop thinking when the last date of the event happens. Nobody thinks, okay, what's happening actually afterwards? What do we do? There are a few exceptions of good practice. I'll give you one example. London decided not to build a proper new velodrome. No, it was another facility, I can't remember now. But it went to Brazil because it was actually built so that it could be taken apart and shipped over here. So these are the kind of post-event plans which people can actually make. I had a ticket, although it's not a sport I like very much, to see beach volleyball at the London Olympics, and I was basically sitting on a huge system of scaffolding. Scaffolding, these metal things you put around houses when you want to walk on them. And it was taken down in 24 hours after the event. Perfect solution. Costs hardly anything to build it, put a few seats on there, bit of cover, absolutely fine, and 24 hours after the event it had gone. So, the more radical solutions here, and that's my last slide, they should become non-profit organizations and events. Take the profit motive out of them, because right now they are very much kind of guided and driven by the profit idea and turn them into non-profit events, and that means that, for example, all profits need to be redistributed and reinvested immediately over a short period of time into the sports infrastructure of the host countries and so on. And finally, that has been raised a couple of times, but FIFA and IOC are obviously very reluctant to even consider this, that they should no longer be independent governing bodies of sport, but overseen, and overseen means really, in my sense, controlled by UNESCO, United Nations Educational and Scientific, which would require them to be more accountable, because right now they're not accountable to anybody apart from its own executive committee, and this is a very clandestine group of people. So, thank you for listening. Do you have any questions or points you want to talk about? Okay, I better keep this one. Yes, please.
How likely do you believe that this is to happen?
Unlikely.
Very unlikely, huh?
Very unlikely.
Yeah.
Because FIFA and IOC are very, very powerful. They are also used to the principle and practice of corruption.
Yeah.
And they will fight any of these, particularly the more radical solution that they go non-profit, that they become accountable to UNESCO, really to the last minute, because it would take away all the power these two organizations have. So it's unlikely, and yet we need to talk about it all.
Yeah, sure.
Let's just throw it in.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, you say that they should belong on the UN umbrella. We see that, in my point of view, the United Nations has been failing a lot in the last 10 years in all the subjects they take care of. So we see a world with a lot of wars, the injustice war, and the UN has absolutely no power to do anything.
Yeah.
There's just a beautiful organization that didn't do anything. So I do believe right now the IOC and FIFA do a better job in uniting the world in one moment than UN is doing. We can talk about the Paris Agreement, that were a huge amount of people trying to put together an environmental plan to the planet, and then 5 years or 10 years later, we will see no countries doing what they say they will do. And you see Trump leaving the Paris Agreement, and UN can do anything. So, what are you saying? My question is, if we try to put modesty and lower the resources to do these events, are we not threatening them to not exist in a meanwhile as a central, because that city like Toronto or Sao Paulo or Rio becomes the capital of the world for a month. This is why it's so huge. You need to have a lot of infrastructure, policemen, and preparation to do an event like that.
Yeah.
Are we not threatening the future of these events by saying then they are absolutely outrageous to the community?
Yeah.
Because I do believe they are.
Okay.
I do believe they damage the community, the local community.
Yeah.
But they do a better good right now for the world, a xenophobic
Okay.
world. Most of that countries that say I don't want the World Cup or Olympic Games, there are a lot of people that are xenophobic too.
Okay. I think there's two elements to your question.
Yeah.
Let me go back to the first one. I share some of your concerns, not all of them, about the United Nations as an umbrella organization for the world, because it's not as effective as one would hope and solve conflicts and so on. And yet there is one organization within the United Nations that has always been able to operate quite independently and more successfully than United Nations, because the General Assembly is dealing with a great, grand political conflicts, whether this is wars, genocide, and so on. But my suggestion is link it to UNESCO, because UNESCO has carved out a niche for itself, and obviously depending on funds and all these kind of things, has done a lot of good work. So it wouldn't go directly to the top of United Nations, but really be allocated to a specific organization that has a history of doing a lot of good things. The second part of your question, yes, I believe, like you, that these mega events do actually bring the world together. They contribute to globalization, a better understanding of what's happening in other parts of the world. So think about maybe, I don't know, if you have an interest in the Winter Olympics, you may have noticed in February North and South Korea. So that's a conflict which the rest of the world has almost forgotten. Okay? But here the world is fully aware of it. So there are these kind of really good things about knowing that the people in Germany, in Russia, in Afghanistan watch the same opening ceremony at the same time, and there's something about this which is great, okay? And I'm not questioning that. What I'm questioning is that the hosting in specific countries has not gone right, but it has gone wrong. And that needs to be changed in order to perhaps even improve the benefits of these events for the rest of the world, if they're not that driven by commercial and political interests. Yeah, that's the two parts, I think, to your question. Anybody else?
Udo, have you been heard about Japan organization of 2020?
I know very little about the Tokyo Olympics so far, but it will be very interesting because it's obviously also in a huge city, in one of the largest in the world. So I will be surprised to see how the logistics are going to work. But so far the news is relatively okay. There is nothing which has already kind of come across to the rest of the world that things are going very wrong. So I don't know yet. Any? Please.
In Tokyo 2020, they still will build huge venues for people coming. So one of the challenges of Tokyo is to deal with the weather because it will be very hot.
Yeah.
And they are rebuilding the Tokyo Olympic Stadium.
Yeah.
At the same foundations that they did in 1950.
Yeah.
So probably it will be as big as possible, and probably they will give the tickets to the sponsor too.
Yeah, I mean, that will not change in the short term. I mean, the sponsors will have privileges in terms of tickets, in terms of Olympic lanes and so on. But I seem to recall that there were several designs for the Olympic Stadium and that some of them were rejected and things are running a little bit late. But generally, I mean, the history of Tokyo 1964 is quite a positive history because it was quite low-key and yet very, very successful. So yes, I mean, there are challenges like the weather, but we'll have to see. I don't know anything. I struggle to predict here. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much for coming and listening, and have a good day.
Então é bom quando vai falando devagar, né? Dá pra gente ir pegando. Então, mais uma vez, a gente faz aí a propaganda, a gente agradece. Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Udo pela explanação. Então, hoje foi num viés mais geral dos mega eventos. E amanhã o viés vai ser bem pontual. Então ele vai colocar um pouquinho o festival, esse mega evento que tem na Coreia do Norte e esse viés político e dando aí os exemplos. Inclusive tem um artigo, se vocês desejarem, a gente vai caminhando para vocês. E na quarta tarde, amanhã à tarde, ele também vai fazer essa relação do desenvolvimento dos clubes esportivos da Alemanha, mas também com o desenvolvimento dos patrocinadores, dos fãs, né, e um pouco todo esse enlace aí histórico. Tá? Então amanhã vai ser mais focado nesses dois exemplos. Tá bom? Então hoje foi um pouquinho mais geral, amanhã mais focado. E na quinta é mais voltada à pesquisa.
Quais são os horários?
Amanhã de manhã começa às 9h40, 9h30 a gente faz a abertura e depois a gente dá a palavra para o professor Udo, e à tarde às 3h40. Então, e o que é legal também amanhã é que a gente vai ter quase aí meia hora, 40 minutos de discussão. Então ele apresenta e a gente faz um bate-papo mesmo, tá bom? E hoje, bom, já que vocês finalizaram, se alguém desejar vir trocar e-mails com o professor e conversar um pouquinho com ele, fica à vontade, que a gente tem previsão de sair aqui da EFE só 13h. Tá bom? Obrigada pela presença, todo mundo. É isso. Vamos tirar uma foto.